Greetings. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 2 in Tracy, looking at qualitative research and what it is. So first we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between inductive and deductive research. Inductive research is when you investigate things from the top down, right? From little to big. So if we're thinking of a triangle and the smallest peak is at the top, we're looking at little things and then looking at how they affect or turn into or merge with big things. Deductive, on the other hand, we start with the bigger picture, we start with the context, and then we find little things in there. So that's why we go from the bottom to the top. Emic or emic, and etic or etic, however you want to pronounce it. Emic emerges from the scene, and etic begins with external theories, ET. So we're looking at a big picture, big theories, versus emic, which is emerging from this little thing that's happening. So this example I'm going to show you on video is a great example of emic research.
So this practice of observing people in their natural environments to understand their needs is called ethnography. At the time, it was an academic practice. It grew out of anthropology. Lucy Sussman was the first one to apply it to industry. So even today, not everybody uses ethnography. Most companies will try to understand their customers' needs by asking them directly using tools like focus groups or surveys. But asking people to tell you what they want gets you only so far. As the anthropologist Margaret Mead said, what people say, what people do, and what people say they do are entirely different things. When people do their jobs or just any ordinary activity, much of what you do just becomes invisible to you. It's just what you do. But if you watch people, you start to realize a lot of times people are working around their tools. And it's these gaps or problems people work around that are opportunities for innovation. The thing is, a lot of times when you point them out to people, they'll say, well, sure, it's obvious that's a problem, but they don't think to tell you about it when you ask. To notice it, you have to get out and watch. So I like to think of my job as an ethnographer like this. You sit and you watch the chaos that is human behavior. And if you're patient and you watch for a while and you have a naive state of mind, you start to notice insights that are obvious after you point them out. You start to notice the hidden obvious. Well, how does this work? What is ethnography like?
So you can see there that what was obvious emerged from the scene, and that's why it's an emic approach. Along with different perspectives, there is also different ways to look at data. There's qualitative and quantitative. Now, quantitative is probably one that you're more familiar with. It's where you transform data into numbers, employs statistics, and develops predictions. So, for example, do you know what the boiling point of water is? Well, it's 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius. Unless you're at a different elevation, because depending on the elevation, that can affect the boiling point of water. And we've been able to do that by developing a way to change heat, or not change heat, to show heat by numbers. And that's how the Celsius and the Fahrenheit scale were developed. Now, there are differences from this quantitative research to qualitative research. The first and one of the most obvious is the role of the researcher. A quantitative researcher is someone who tries to keep him or herself as far apart from the data as possible to eliminate bias. A qualitative researcher, on the other hand, is someone who immerses him or herself in the data. And only by immersing him or herself in the data and truly understanding the data can results be derived for that particular research question. It's also different in the representation of the methodology and findings, how we represent what we do and what those findings mean are different. So, for example, someone would never say, who was a qualitative researcher, let's say doing some research in western Wisconsin, would never say, well, this is how people operate in western Wisconsin, therefore it must be true in South Texas. that would be crazy because they're completely different areas, and the researcher presumably has only immersed him or herself in western Wisconsin and not in South Texas. They would need to do both in order to make those kinds of assumptions or draw those kinds of inferences. Now, neither is automatically better, although society, because it is more familiar with the quantitative, often does see quantitative as better, but quantitative, there are some questions that quantitative cannot answer. And so we will talk about that as we move on. So some of the key characteristics of the qualitative process, there's a focus on gestalt, which literally means form or shape, and that one aspect of culture is best understood in relation to another. So let me give you an example of this. How many triangles do you see in this picture? I'll give you just a few seconds to count and decide. And the answer is none. There are no triangles. There are 3 V shapes, and there are 3 circles with wedges cut out of them. But because our mind wants to put things together, it wants to create form, our mind actually sees these lines where there really aren't any. So for example, the quote-unquote white triangle that you might see in the front of the triangle that has the solid black lines outlining it, we see that only because our mind is making those connections. So you can see the one aspect is better understood in relation to the other. We understand that picture only in the context of understanding triangles and seeing triangles. So when we want to do that with culture, participant observation is the key to accessing it, to look and see how do people observe and understand things. You might also look at the qualitative process as a bricolage, where you are piecing together various viewpoints, various perspectives to come up with something that might at one sense be obvious, but in another sense hasn't been necessarily thought of or pulled out in that way before. Just like in the previous example where the letters of the word obvious were obvious, they were at the same time hidden, and it wasn't until we really looked and noticed those things that it became obvious. The qualitative process may use a variety of types of data, and they're often very flexible, very creative, because you have to be thinking in naive ways, thinking of things as strange and new and not as things that you have seen or heard before. So here are some key definitions for qualitative research. Qualitative methods is an umbrella term. It incorporates a lot of different things. It incorporates interviews, document analysis, participant observation. All of those are aspects of qualitative research, along with other things that aren't mentioned here. Naturalistic inquiry is when things happen in uncontrived field settings. In other words, it's not a lab. It's real life. It's things happening when they happen naturally. So unlike in a lab, when you are contriving the scene, right? When you are creating what is going on, naturalistic inquiry looks at what really goes on in real life without any of the controls that are in a laboratory. You also have ethnography, which is immersion in specific cultures. Now, most of the time, this is long-time immersion in specific cultures, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. In some ways, it can depend on the question and what can answer the question. There have been ethnographies that have been done in literally a day or less than a day, but most of the time, ethnographies are seen as long-term, months or years within a specific culture. Ethnographic methods are interviews and participant observation. So that's how we get that information through ethnography. Narrative inquiry is looking at stories. How do people tell stories, and what are some of the functions of those stories? Why do we tell the stories we do, and what purpose do they serve? And then finally, autoethnography, which is looking at one's own self and using your own self as data, coming at it from an analytic perspective, but also an evocative perspective. What does the self evoke that some other data may not be able to do? Finally, you have grounded theory, which is where you start with the data that's around you and then come up with a theory based on that data. So there is a great example of this at this particular YouTube link right here. I would recommend that you take a look at it. The last thing we want to talk about is ethics and the creation of the IRB, which stands for Institutional Research Board. So I strongly suggest that you Google these different things. These are some examples of experiments that went horribly wrong, and not horribly wrong because necessarily unexpected things happen, but because it allowed horrible things to happen to people which should not have been allowed. So because of that, institutions have created human subjects protection, which says that there needs to be really, really good reasons for you to do anything that might harm people. So for example, if you're going to deceive someone, deceiving them that they are tasting spearmint instead of peppermint probably is not a big deal. But deceiving them that their parent has died when their parent really hasn't can do some really psychological harm. So IRBs are meant to protect individuals so that people can't just willy-nilly hurt other people in the name of research. So that's what we have for Chapter 2. Again, this is meant to be a supplement to the reading, but if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. We'll see you next time.